On November 26, 1504, one of the most powerful women in European history drew her final breath. Queen Isabella of Castile, the woman who bankrolled Columbus and unified Spain, died at 53 years old, leaving behind a kingdom, an empire, and a daughter who would become the center of the most disturbing conspiracy of the Renaissance. Her name was Joanna, and within 2 years of her mother's death, the two most powerful men in her life would sign a secret document declaring her too insane to rule. One of those men was her own father, the other was her husband. And here's what makes this story so chilling. Historians have spent 5 centuries trying to answer one impossible question. Was Joanna of Castile actually mad, or was she the victim of the most elaborate political betrayal in history? Because the men who declared her insane stood to inherit everything she owned. Fast forward to April 11, 1555. An elderly woman dies in a palace called Tordesillas. She is 75 years old. She has been Queen of Castile for 51 years and Queen of Aragon for 39. But here's the part that should horrify you. She spent 46 of those years locked inside that palace, forbidden from speaking to anyone, forbidden from looking out. Windows kept in darkened rooms while her son ruled an empire in her name. The official story claimed she was too mad to govern. But the documents that survived from that palace tell a very different story. One involving torture, systematic psychological manipulation, and a woman whose so-called madness only became visible the moment she became inconvenient to the men around her. To understand how Joanna ended up dying as a prisoner in her own kingdom, we need to go back to that November day in 1504 when everything changed. Queen Isabella had given birth to 4 children, but by the time of her death, 3 of them were already in their graves. Her only son Juan died in 1497. Her eldest daughter, also named Isabella, died in 1498. Her grandson Miguel, who might have inherited the throne, died in 1500 at just 2 years old. That left Joanna, the 3rd child, the one who had been trained in needlework, dancing, and French conversation. The skills you're taught a princess destined to marry some foreign nobleman. Not the skills you're taught someone who might actually rule the largest empire on earth. But suddenly, overnight, Joanna wasn't just a princess married to a Habsburg archduke in distant Flanders. She was Queen of Castile, and one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe now belonged to her by law. This created an immediate and dangerous problem for 2 very ambitious men. The first was Ferdinand, Joanna's own father, who had ruled alongside Isabella for 3 decades and had absolutely no intention of surrendering power to his daughter just because his wife happened to die. Under Castilian law, Ferdinand had no legal right to Castile at all. It belonged to Joanna and only Joanna. The second man was Philip, Joanna's husband, called Philip the Handsome because by all accounts he was devastatingly attractive. He was also the son of the Holy Roman Emperor, which made him one of the most eligible men in Europe. But under Castilian law, marriage didn't automatically grant a husband power over his wife's kingdom. Philip's official title would be King Juarixaris, king by right of his wife, meaning his authority existed only because Joanna allowed it. Neither Ferdinand nor Philip found this arrangement remotely acceptable, and this is where the story of Joanna's madness truly begins. Because here is the disturbing part that history often glosses over. There are no documented concerns about Joanna's mental state before 1504. None whatsoever. She had traveled across Europe, represented her parents at foreign courts, learned multiple languages, and given birth to healthy children. But the very moment she becomes heir to a throne that 2 powerful men desperately want for themselves, suddenly everyone around her becomes deeply concerned about her mental health. In 1506, Ferdinand and Philip did something extraordinary and sinister. They met in secret and signed a document called the Treaty of Villafila, formally agreeing to exclude Joanna from all governmental power. Their justification: her alleged mental instability, her own father and her own husband, signing away her rights behind her back. And understand this, the treaty was signed in complete secrecy. Joanna didn't know about it. The Castilian nobles didn't know about it. It was a private agreement between 2 men deciding what to do with a woman's inheritance, and she would only discover the betrayal when it was far too late. Now you might be thinking, surely they had evidence, medical testimony, some documented proof of her insanity. So let's examine that evidence, because what you're about to hear reveals everything about how this conspiracy actually worked. The primary proof of Joanna's madness comes from a handful of episodes, all of which occurred during periods of extreme emotional trauma, and all of which were recorded by people who had direct political reasons to portray her as unstable. In 1502, Philip simply rode off to Flanders without telling Joanna. He just left. Joanna, who was deeply in love with her husband despite his constant and very public infidelities, was devastated. Her mother Isabella responded by having her locked in the castle at Medina del Campo. According to observers loyal to Isabella, Joanna paced erratically, babbled incoherently, and refused to eat or sleep. But pause for a moment and consider this. Joanna's husband had abandoned her without warning. Her mother's response was to imprison her. And when Joanna reacted with distress to being both abandoned and locked away, this was recorded as evidence of mental illness. Then there were Philip's affairs. Contemporary accounts describe Joanna as intensely, even violently jealous. She reportedly had rages and physically attacked court ladies she suspected of sleeping with her husband. But here's the thing. Philip was sleeping with those women. His affairs were open, notorious, and deliberately humiliating. Joanna's jealousy wasn't delusional. It was a rational response to her husband publicly betraying her at every opportunity. But in the 16th century, a woman who objected to her husband's infidelities wasn't seen as justified. She was seen as hysterical, unreasonable, potentially insane. And then came the episode that would define her reputation for 500 years. In September 1506, Philip the Handsome died suddenly in Burgos. He was 28 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever, though rumors of poisoning circulated without evidence. Joanna was 8 months pregnant with their 6th child. What happened next became the foundation of the Joanna the Mad narrative that persists to this day. Initially, Joanna refused to allow Philip to be buried. When she finally permitted a funeral ceremony, she later ordered the coffin exhumed, and then, according to multiple contemporary accounts, she began a pilgrimage across Castile with her husband's corpse. She traveled with the coffin for months, opening it periodically to verify Philip was still inside. She ate meals beside it. She slept near it. She refused to be separated from it. In January 1507, during this journey, she gave birth to her 6th child, a daughter named Catherine, in the village of Torquemada. She was back on the road with a coffin within days. If this sounds like a dark history channel could really use your voice right now, the stories we uncover here, the forgotten voices, the buried truths, they matter. And if you believe history should remember more than just the victors, hit that subscribe button, because what comes next in Joanna's story will change everything you think you know about power, madness, and the lengths men will go to steal a throne. Now, this corpse pilgrimage sounds absolutely insane. It sounds like undeniable proof of profound mental illness, but modern historians have pointed out several uncomfortable truths that complicate this narrative. First, Joanna had stated that she wanted Philip buried in Granada next to her mother Isabella. This wasn't a delusion, it was Philip's own expressed wish, and it aligned with royal burial tradition. Transporting his body to Granada required exactly what Joanna was doing, moving the coffin across Castile. Second, the practice of keeping royal corpses unburied for extended periods was nearly as unusual as it might seem to modern eyes. Royal bodies were routinely preserved and transported significant distances for politically important burials. Joanna's behavior, while extreme, had precedent. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Joanna was experiencing what we would now recognize as catastrophic, complicated grief. She had lost her brother in 1497, her sister in 1498, her nephew in 1500, her mother in 1504, and now her husband in 1506. 5 devastating losses in 9 years. And she was pregnant, postpartum, and surrounded by people who viewed her grief not as human suffering but as a political opportunity. But here's what actually mattered at the time. While Joanna grieved, her father Ferdinand was busy. He circulated reports of her madness throughout the kingdom. He presented himself to the Castilian nobility as the stable, rational alternative, the man who would govern in place of his dangerously unstable daughter, and it worked perfectly. In February 1509, Ferdinand issued an order that would define the rest of Joanna's life. She was to be confined to the royal palace of Tordesillas, adjacent to the convent of Santa Clara. The stated reason was her mental instability. The practical effect was that Ferdinand, and later Joanna's own son Charles, could rule her kingdoms without any interference from the person who actually legally owned them. Joanna was 29 years old when those palace doors closed behind her. She would not leave Tordesillas until she died at 75, 46 years of imprisonment. The conditions of her confinement reveal something deeply disturbing about whether Joanna was being treated for mental illness or simply being erased. Her initial guardian was a man named Mosen Ferrer. When Ferdinand died in 1516 and Cardinal Cisneros investigated conditions at Tordesillas, what he discovered horrified him. Ferrer admitted to using la cuerda on the Queen of Castile. La cuerda was torture, a method involving suspending a person by ropes with weights attached to their body. Ferrer claimed he had done this to preserve her life when she refused to eat. He tortured the reigning queen to make her eat. Cisneros immediately suspended Ferrer, writing that he had been endangering the health and life of Her Highness, describing what he found at Tordesillas as atrocities. But Cisneros didn't free Joanna. He simply replaced her torturers with different jailers. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Joanna technically became Queen of Aragon as well as Castile, making her monarch of all Spain and its rapidly expanding colonial empire. Her son Charles, just 16 years old, arrived in Spain to claim his inheritance. Legally, that inheritance belonged to his mother. Charles's solution was brutally elegant. He would rule as co-monarch alongside Joanna, with himself handling all actual governance while she remained locked away in darkness. He appointed the Marquis of Denia as Joanna's new guardian, with explicit instructions about how to manage his mother. She was to be kept in dark, poorly lit rooms. She was forbidden from looking out windows to prevent her from being seen or calling for help. She was completely cut off from all communication with the outside world. Charles's exact words in his orders were chilling. No person speak with Her Majesty, for no good could come from it. Even the poor Clare nuns who attended her were instructed not to speak to her. And then the Marquis did something truly sinister. He engaged in deliberate psychological manipulation. For 4 years after Ferdinand's death, the Marquis told Joanna that her father was still alive, He fabricated letters supposedly from Ferdinand. He maintained an elaborate fiction to keep Joanna confused about basic reality. Think about what this means. If Joanna showed any signs of being disconnected from reality, if she expressed beliefs that didn't match the facts, how would anyone know if this was mental illness or the predictable result of years of systematic deception? But in 1520, 14 years into her confinement, something happened that shatters every assumption about Joanna's mental state. Spanish cities revolted against Charles V in what became known as the Comunero Revolt. The rebels were protesting Charles's foreign advisors and his disregard for Castilian interests, and they had a powerful card to play. The actual legal Queen of Castile was still alive, locked in a palace just miles away. The rebels came to Tordesillas, and for 103 days, they controlled the palace and had direct access to Joanna. They offered her freedom. They offered her genuine political power. All she had to do was sign documents declaring herself the legitimate ruler, documents that would undermine Charles's authority and legitimize their rebellion. And Joanna refused. Not because she was too mad to understand what was happening, but because she understood exactly what was happening and made a strategic decision. She employed sophisticated delaying tactics, asking to see specific provisions, requesting her council be present, making excuses about needing different signatures. For 103 days she stalled, buying time until Charles's forces could recapture Tordesillas. This is not the behavior of someone incapable of complex reasoning. This is the behavior of someone who understood that signing those documents would destabilize her son's rule and potentially plunge Spain into civil war. Joanna chose to remain imprisoned rather than harm her son's kingdom. When Charles's forces retook Tordesillas, Joanna went back to her darkened rooms, her silent nuns, and her total isolation. She had demonstrated sophisticated political judgment under pressure. Charles's response was to tighten her restrictions even further. The last 35 years of Joanna's life are almost unbearable to contemplate. She lived in literal darkness, her rooms kept poorly lit with restricted access to windows and natural light. She was forbidden visitors. Charles rarely came. Her other children, scattered across European thrones, were not permitted to see her. She was systematically deceived about the outside world, with the Marquis controlling all information she received. She retained her legal titles, with every official document referring to her as Queen and coins minted with her name, but she exercised absolutely no power whatsoever. Modern historians have noted a deeply uncomfortable truth. Even if Joanna began her confinement with some degree of mental illness, the conditions of that confinement were specifically designed to destroy a person's sanity. Complete isolation, sensory deprivation, denial of human contact, psychological manipulation. We would recognize these conditions today as a form of torture, and they were applied to a reigning queen for nearly half a century. By 1555, Joanna had outlived almost everyone who remembered her as anything other than the Mad Queen locked away in Tordesillas. She was 75 years old and had spent more years in prison than many people lived in total. On April 11, 1555, Joanna of Castile died. She had been Queen of Castile for 51 years, Queen of Aragon for 39, mother of emperors and queens, and she had spent 46 of those years as a prisoner. Her body was eventually transferred to Granada, the destination she had tried to reach all those years ago with Philip's corpse, and she was laid to rest in the royal chapel next to Philip and her parents. In death, she finally achieved what she had been denied in life. She was reunited with her family. So was Joanna actually mad? The honest answer is we don't know, and we probably never will. What we do know is this: the accusations of madness appeared precisely when she became inconvenient to powerful men. The men who declared her mad stood to gain everything from her incapacity. The conditions of her confinement were designed to cause psychological damage, not treat it. And when given an opportunity to demonstrate her mental capacity, she showed sophisticated political judgment. Joanna may have suffered from genuine mental illness after experiencing devastating losses, constant betrayal, and unimaginable trauma. But the way her suffering was weaponized, the secret treaties, the lies, the isolation, the torture, tells us something profoundly disturbing about how power worked in her era. When a woman's authority became inconvenient, mental illness provided the perfect mechanism to remove it. No trial, no public debate, just a diagnosis that conveniently aligned with the political interests of the men around her. History remembers Ferdinand the Pragmatic and Charles the Powerful. Maybe it's time we remember the woman they couldn't break. The woman who survived 46 years of darkness, lies, and isolation, who protected her son's throne even when it cost her everything, who endured until she was 75 years old. Joanna of Castile was called the Mad for 500 years. But the more you learn about her story, the harder that label becomes to accept. She was a queen who was never allowed to rule, a mother whose children were taken from her, a woman whose grief was treated as insanity and whose imprisonment was called treatment, and she survived it all. Leave a comment below. Do you think Joanna was actually insane, or was she the victim of history's most elaborate conspiracy? Because this question has haunted historians for 5 centuries, and maybe it's finally time we gave her the justice she was denied in life.